Hi, I'm Rob Wolf, Director of Communications at the Center for Court Innovation, and today I'm talking with a colleague of mine, Kristine Herman, who's the Director of Global Gender Initiatives and also our Associate Director of Domestic Violence Programs. Kristine spent 3 months in Afghanistan from September to December 2009. Thanks, Kristine, for taking the time to talk to me.
My pleasure.
Tell me about this. You went to Afghanistan for 3 months. What brought about this trip?
Well, there is an international organization called the International Developmental Law Organization, and they had reached out to me here at the center to ask if I would be interested in going to help the Attorney General of Afghanistan create the first Violence Against Women prosecution unit.
So tell me, how do you go about designing and establishing a unit like this? What sort of resources are at your disposal? What about the laws? What about staff? And perhaps this is too much for one question, but what is it like for you coming in internationally, not speaking the language and not even necessarily knowing their particular legal system?
Right. Well, I mean, that is a big question. I think in some respects, this was a perfect project for me to be able to do coming from 9 years at the Center for Court Innovation and the expertise that we have here, because the skills and the principles in creating a specialized project of any kind were very transferable. So the issues, that come up in creating this and the challenges and the process were not that different from working with folks in Australia or in Michigan or, really those kinds of things were perfectly transferable. I was able to do a process that was step by step what I would want to do in any jurisdiction.
Just give me a quick overview of what some of those steps are when you're landing. You have 3 months. So what are some of the steps that you went through?
So the very first step was having a planning team created. And so some of that is sort of who we would identify as needing to be at the table to plan this, but also having the Attorney General's office decide who are they appointing to be part of this planning process and working closely with them. Then, of course, what we do at the center all the time, we wanted to look at, what's happening right now with any of these cases? What happens? What's the current practice? So finding out what the problem looks like there on the ground from the victim perspective, the social service providers, and then how many cases make it to the police, then the prosecutors, and then eventually the courts. And what's interesting about trying to do that kind of analysis in Afghanistan is there's no data collection system. So there isn't like an ability to do a caseload analysis where someone's looking up in a database how many cases were reported last year. This really required us to have individualized meetings with every piece of the process and ask them questions about what they do keep as far as data, which is all on paper, and what anecdotally they think is happening. And some statistics and numbers exist. The Attorney General's office keeps some loose statistics in one department for one area, it's sort of, and you can kind of infer from that what the problem really is. The next part of the process was really a combination of logistics like supports around space, office stuff, supplies, the idea of that they will need to have staff, how many staff. In addition to that kind of logistical stuff, we set apart to really draft protocols and procedures and policies around every issue that's meaningful to a specialized unit. So this planning document envisions what are the screening processes, what is the case eligibility requirements, how they will flow through the unit from referral all the way through disposition and appeals. Every step of the way that I'm talking about was done through translators. Every piece of paper was written in our native languages, translated through a translation department, and then given to the other partners to comment on in their native language, translated back into the other language.
How many languages were you working with?
Well, a grand total of 3, although the dominant language there was Dari, and then my language English, but there were some folks who speak Pashto.
You didn't mention anything about having to change the laws,
Right.
And I know from previous conversations you've said that, in fact, the laws are on the books to protect women. Sure. But perhaps you could talk to me about some of the cultural obstacles you encountered or the observations you have about the culture or the lack of enforcement for these laws in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fascinating thing about Afghanistan is that on the books, on the face of it, the laws are really good. They're, the Constitution is new and cutting edge. It's very, egalitarian and anti-discrimination. So it's really powerful Constitution. And in fact, while I was there, right before I got there, they passed a Violence Against Women Act. So they have a law now that's specifically around eliminating violence against women, which even specifies further crimes against women, very detailed. So forced prostitution, child marriage. What's interesting about it is that despite these laws being on the books, there has been in the past zero enforcement of these laws because of really traditional cultural practices and attitudes and beliefs about the status of women in society.
So
for example, there are some traditional cultural practices called Bad and Badal, and what each of those means respectively is that if you have a dispute with your neighbor or with a person in another village, or there's a land dispute or a fight between families, one way to settle that is to trade daughters. Those daughters who are traded become not just servants and slaves within the new household, but then they're also married off to some much older male family member within the home often. So you've got, forced labor, you've got child or forced marriage, and that's a cultural practice that exists. Selling of girls and daughters is also a traditional practice. The number one reason women in Afghanistan are in prison is for the crime that is not on the books of running away. So running away from home is a crime simply because you don't have the right to not be in the home that you live in or were bought into or sold into. So that's some of the cultural practices that are in direct conflict with the law.
So the law says a woman can choose where she wants to live.
Absolutely. Law says the practices of Bad and Badal are illegal. The law says you cannot beat your wife, for example. However, it is very common practice to beat your wife in Afghanistan, and it is culturally acceptable if she behaves in a way that you don't find acceptable. That's your response.
The law now protects them. How recent are these laws? Is this all a result of the Taliban being removed, and under the Taliban's code, it affirmed these cultural practices?
I think that the Taliban ruling really reinforced, perpetuated, and even hardened some of these cultural practices. Some of the laws that are good laws aren't actually brand new. I mean, the Constitution is new, but some of the criminal laws actually are from the 60s, and from earlier times. And so, in the U.S., when we talk about domestic violence, we aren't necessarily having to create a new law. In New York, you're prosecuted for assault, right?
Right.
And similarly, in Afghanistan, they could always apply that crime. In a case of violence against women, there's been a horrific assault or a beating, or some of the horrible cases where I interviewed women who had their nose chopped off by their husband's family and their ears chopped off by their husband's family. Those family members were never prosecuted. And of course, under the law, even from the 60s, they could have been prosecuted, and they were not. And so It's really application of existing law that is lacking there, and that sort of cultural will to address violence against women in a meaningful way. What was, I want to not be too negative here, what it was very, very, very promising and optimistic was that women in society 100% recognized this chasm between on the books and application, and they 100% were totally self-aware of the problem culturally and traditionally with the practices that women and girls were being subjected to and what they deserved under the law on a basic human rights level. They understood that huge difference, and so there is a very big community of women who are working on this issue in Afghanistan, who are writing about this issue, who are opening up shelters to help women victims of violence. And there is not a lot of attention paid to it sort of on a larger political sphere, but it is definitely not something that's being imposed from the outside, but it's something that within the country itself, 50% of the population is well aware that there's maltreatment.
You finished your work in December, the unit, you'd established it. I understand when you came back, they had yet to actually have a case. Yeah. What's the latest word that you've heard from your colleagues in Afghanistan?
Right. So in January, they finished a 20-hour training for the 9 violence against women prosecutors and an additional 7 key defense attorneys that we wanted to be really, really aggressively trained on violence against women issues. These are defense attorneys who frequently are the attorneys for the women, because often these issues get very muddied and muddled, and women victims of violence often are prosecuted, A, for running away, or B, if they're a victim of rape, but they can't prove the rape case, but you can prove intercourse outside of marriage, then the victim herself is the one who goes to prison. So you've got frequently the women victims of violence have their own attorneys to help them with this very complicated issue of criminal issues and family issues and divorce issues, because you really can't easily divorce or separate in Afghanistan or leave home. And they opened the unit and they started receiving referrals. And I think the first two big cases they got were both cases of rape of children, girl children, within families. So by extended family members, by brother-in-laws and multiple uncles. And so by taking these early cases that are really so egregious that most people would look at going, this isn't an okay practice. Culturally, it's not okay. Societally, it's not okay.
Because it's involving young children.
Exactly. It's a little bit more of a sympathetic population.
Right.
It's helping to set the tone that these cases are important and we should be taking them seriously, and they're going forward with those. So they've started to receive their first cases. We're pretty excited about it.
Do you think you've taken anything back with you? Either whether it's lessons learned, things that didn't work?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's sort of two things come immediately to mind. The first one is simply that you can do a lot in a short amount of time if you have very willing partners. So, we often, at least in the projects I work on, engage in a planning process that can take 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. But truth be told, I really found out from my experience there that you can do a lot in 3 months if you are meeting 3 times a week and 5 days a week. You're trying to, draft new agendas, exchange documents, give each other draft versions of things. We did in 3 months what it normally would take me back here, 10 to 12 months. So I felt very comfortable and confident that we could do a lot more with what we're doing if we decided that we wanted to, and that we had partners who were really engaged as much as we're engaged. So that's a really exciting thing.
And you were cut off from family and friends, right?
So it's all you're doing.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and then the other lesson I guess learned was one I knew going into it, but it was just so reinforced coming back, was the importance of the community engagement piece. And I think that no one there really knew or thought that there was that much value in engaging the community as part of the process for planning the unit. And I kind of had learned from my experience here at the center that this is something we do and there's a really valid reason for doing it. And I don't know if I could have articulated as well as I can now, which is that the success of this unit hinges upon victims of violence against women and their lawyers or their shelter workers, and so if we hadn't engaged the community on an aggressive level by meeting with them individually, by doing focus groups with women victims of violence, by visiting the shelters, by laying the groundwork to really have the community feel like they helped shape it, it would be a unit that existed with no referrals.
I'm very curious to know what life was like for you there. Could you give me a sense of what your day-to-day life was like?
Sure. Well, first off, as a woman there, it was very important to be respectful of the culture. So for that, it meant that I always covered my hair. I always wore very loose clothes that often came to my knees. Towards the end of my time there, the Attorney General's office, the head of the Violence Against Women unit, actually gave me a headscarf as a present, and she said she was so thrilled to see that I was wearing headscarves throughout this planning process. It just made her more comfortable. Like I was willing to come to some common ground. It didn't hurt me to do it, and it basically opened the doors a little bit for us to talk. So the streets of Kabul are fascinating because you can't walk on them if you're an international. There's generally rules that you cannot and should not ever walk on the street. And in fact, with the organization I was with, you could be sent home if you walked on the streets, because the risk is so great for kidnapping and death. So you don't walk anywhere. You drive everywhere, or you're driven, I should say. You're driven everywhere. And so on the one hand, I really relished the times when I got out and got to go to meetings, and we would drive through the streets of Kabul and I would see daily life and see people shopping and doing what they do. On the other hand, it's also very nerve-wracking because it's the most dangerous times as a foreigner when you're in the roads.
I have a million more questions, but we've run out of time. I've been talking to Kristine Herman, a colleague of mine here at the Center for Court Innovation. She's Director of Global Gender Initiatives and the Associate Director of Domestic Violence Programs here at the Center for Court Innovation. And she was talking to me about her recent 3 months in Afghanistan, where she was helping the Attorney General's office create a specialized violence against women unit.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Rob Wolf, Director of Communications at the Center for Court Innovation. To find out more about the Center, you can visit our website at www.courtinnovation.org. Thanks for listening. much.